Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. Legal conflicts over the Biden administration's Title IX rule and other questions about transgender student athletes have continued to brew over the past week. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what's the latest on the cases surrounding Title IX?
Yeah, so most recently we had an appellate court, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, block the Title IX rules from the Biden administration, the Department of Education there. So that's like the most recent action, and that was basically said that it upheld an emergency court order that it also provided in a number of states: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. So that's kind of the latest, is that there was an emergency injunction granted, and then just last week it found that would continue while they're continuing to litigate these sorts of questions. And so it's, if you're not familiar with an injunction, it's just like, you can't do this, you can't implement something while we're talking about it, or some kind of court order while litigation continues. And it's not like a final decision, but it does. There's like sort of a high bar, right, for those who are bringing a case and asking for that court action to show that they're going to succeed on the merits in order to get that. So there's sort of a high bar in terms of what you have to be able to make your case successfully enough that the court is like, well, there's a good reason that you're going to have some kind of harm that will continue if we don't take this action. So it's a kind of an interesting, it's like a litmus test of we know that this is going to happen, or we have a pretty good idea. So it can be helpful when you're trying to figure out where is a court going to land on something by looking at these kinds of injunctions, where is it landing? And so it's not a determinative thing, and it could just be that they needed some more time to talk about it, and they felt like it's appropriate to have that. And so this now is, as far as I'm aware, every court that has ruled on this has put a stop to the Department of Education's Title IX rulemaking in terms of implementation. Every single court where it has been challenged has said, we need to stop and talk about this, in court before it is allowed to continue. And so this, before the appellate court ruled on this, there was an aberration to that sort of trend that we've seen where courts have put in these injunctions, and they said that the Biden administration would be allowed to implement the rule, that it would be essentially helpful for all these other provisions in there for them to go into effect and protect, transgender students or students who are pregnant, and these different kinds of provisions in it. But then the Court of Appeals stepped in and offered that emergency injunction, and then has offered this more sort of permanent, not really permanent, but sort of this whole this lasting injunction as litigation continues.
And now a similar issue that's not necessarily legally tied to the Title IX case. There's a case out of Virginia concerning a middle school transgender student who's going out for the girls' tennis team. First of all, what are the rules being challenged in this case? What's the judge's conclusion? Yeah,
so that's a very interesting thing, and it kind of happens concurrently with what is happening concurrently with a lot of these other discussions that we're having. But essentially, the Hanover County School Board in Hanover, Virginia, had denied a student a place on the tennis team because it has a policy on transgender students. And then that federal judge overturned the policy that issued an injunction, what we're talking about, and said you can't implement that policy, while we're talking about these things, while this litigation continues. And what's at the heart of that is that the school policy basically does it single out transgender students because of their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth, that incongruence there. So basically the school policy says that students must play sports in alignment with the sex assigned to them at birth for the sake of, quote, fairness and competition for all participants. So that's sort of what's at the heart of the school policy, is they're saying, we don't allow transgender students to play on the team that aligns with their gender identity. They have to play on the one that aligns with their sex assigned at birth because of this fairness and competition sort of doctrine. We want to promote this. But in this specific case, it's really interesting. The judge laid out how the student whose sex was male at birth, and that she is now, has been on hormones for years and would not have a competitive advantage, and basically said to the school, you can't implement this policy, while we're continuing to litigate this. but kind of got really into the treatment plan for the students' transition. And it was just like a very hard look at these policies and challenging the school board and saying that, how do you can't really have this doctrine here about the fairness and competition without looking at this specific student's case, and that it wouldn't be necessarily an unfair advantage for her to play with the girls' tennis team.
They did, in the case, mention these Title IX rules. Why did the judge say that wasn't what's at issue here?
Yeah, so it's an interesting kind of legal argument. Essentially, the way that the judge put it is that this isn't really about those transgender rulings or provisions in Title IX, but it's about sex discrimination. So in basically saying that because the student is legally female in terms of the state, that it would not apply to like a gender identity sort of invocation, like instead of sex. So that's, part of the existing law is, that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. And the court's argument essentially was that this student is not invoking like that gender identity provision that's in the new rules, but instead sex discrimination because she is female, essentially. And so like that was the argument.
Is that partially because this student has a state birth certificate that was issued to them as female, like that's something that they made that change legally? Yeah,
I think so. And so I think it is still, related to these kinds of issues, but in terms of like the court's eyes going out there and like the court put down there, like this is not related to like that gender identity thing instead of sex discrimination. And specifically, I think it gets into that fairness of like that fairness and competition thing. Like, how do you know that a student wouldn't be able to compete fairly with her teammates because of this treatment plan. So I think that is sort of the argument there, is that it is in the eyes of the state that the student, who's unnamed, there's is an anonymous sort of complaint to protect identifiable information for a minor, but to protect her information, but that she is a female for all intents and purposes under the law. So I think that would be the argument there. But it is sort of related to these kinds of conversations around gender identity and sports and fairness.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. I'm sure we'll continue to cover these stories and other similar ones as these legal questions continue to be hashed out. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at chalkboardnews.com.